The chains of oppression tighten. The cries of a nation rise into the heavens. A hardened king refuses to yield, unaware that divine judgment stands at his doorstep. As the waters turn to blood and darkness suffocates the land, one man, armed with faith, steps forward to challenge the might of Egypt. The battle for freedom begins, and with it, the greatest escape in history, the Exodus. Welcome to Mindful Musing, a journey with God, where faith comes alive, and every story reminds us that the God of yesterday is still the God of today. Here, we dive deep into the untold wonders of Scripture, immersive, emotional, powerful. Stories that stir your spirit, ignite your faith, and draw you closer to the heart of God. Subscribe now and join the journey, as we step into one of the most astonishing moments in all of biblical history. For centuries, the Israelites suffered beneath the iron grip of Pharaoh, their backs bent from slavery, their hope fading with each passing day. But in the shadows of Egypt's towering empire, prophecy stirred. A deliverer rose, Moses, chosen by God, called from the wilderness to demand the impossible. Let my people go. What followed was a battle not of swords, but of divine power. 10 plagues shook Egypt's foundations. The Red Sea split apart. A nation walked into freedom, guided by the fire of God. But the journey was far from over. This is the Exodus, the deliverance of a nation, the test of faith, and the triumph of prophecy. The chains rattled. The whips cracked. The cries of an enslaved people rose into the suffocating sky. For 400 years, the Israelites had lived under the rule of Pharaoh, once welcomed as honored guests during Joseph's reign, now crushed beneath the weight of Egyptian oppression. They had built the grand monuments of an empire that despised them, their backs bent, their hands calloused, their spirits weary from unrelenting labor. Yet, amid the suffering, there remained a promise. A prophecy whispered through generations. A deliverance awaited them. And the Almighty was watching. Pharaoh feared the Israelites, not for their strength in battle, but for their sheer numbers. They are multiplying too quickly, he warned his advisors. If they rise against us, Egypt will fall. So the order was given. Every male child born to the Hebrews, cast him into the Nile. Infants taken from their mothers. Fathers watching helplessly. The waters of Egypt turning into a graveyard of innocent blood. But one mother refused to accept the decree. Jochebed, an Israelite woman, held her newborn son close. His cries were soft, yet within them carried the weight of prophecy. She could not let him perish, not like the others. So she placed him in a basket, lined it with pitch, and set him upon the waters, trusting that the Almighty would carry him to safety. The current led the basket straight into the heart of Egypt, where Pharaoh's daughter discovered the child. She named him Moses. And though he was raised as a prince, clothed in fine linen and trained in the ways of Egyptian royalty, his heart remained with his people. A call from the wilderness. Years passed. Moses became a man. A warrior. A scholar. A prince with both power and privilege. But destiny did not belong to Pharaoh's house. One day, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave mercilessly. The rage that had long been buried within him surfaced in an instant. He struck the Egyptian down. Blood stained his hands. The crime was unforgivable. Moses fled. Into the wilderness, far from the echoes of Egypt, far from the burden of his people, far from the life he had once known. Until the flames called him. Deep within the mountains of Horeb, he saw it, a bush, engulfed in fire. Yet it did not burn. Then, the voice spoke. Moses, Moses. His breath caught. Here I am, he whispered. Take off your sandals, for you stand on holy ground. The fire was not destruction. It was the presence of the Almighty. And in that sacred moment, Moses heard the words that would change history forever. I have heard the cries of my people. I have seen their suffering. Now, I send you to Pharaoh, to deliver them. Moses trembled. Who am I to lead them? Who will believe me? But the Almighty answered, I will be with you. Tell them, I am has sent me. The desert winds roared. The flames pulsed. And prophecy set Moses on a path from which he could never turn back. Moses returned to Egypt, a shepherd no longer just tending sheep, but tending the future of a nation. With his brother, Aaron, at his side, he marched into Pharaoh's grand palace, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go. Pharaoh laughed. Who is this God that I should listen to him? The Almighty will show you. Pharaoh was unyielding. His heart hardened. He refused to free the Israelites. So the judgment began. The beginning of plagues. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned to blood. The fish perished. The waters reeked with death. And yet, Pharaoh remained defiant. It is nothing. My sorcerers can do the same. So the Almighty struck again. Plagues of frogs swarmed the land. Then gnats and lice, crawling upon skin, filling every corner. Then flies, thick as the darkness that would soon follow. Egypt began to weaken. Yet Pharaoh did not yield. His kingdom stood upon the edge of ruin, but he refused to surrender. And soon, the final judgment would come. The promise of Passover. The Almighty spoke one final warning. If you do not let my people go, the firstborn of Egypt will perish. Pharaoh did not believe. He refused to listen. So the moment arrived, the first Passover. The Israelites prepared their escape. They marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. They ate unleavened bread in haste, ready to flee. And at midnight, the plague swept across Egypt. Cries pierced the silence. Families wept. Pharaoh's own son lay lifeless in his arms. And at last, he broke. Go, he whispered. Go before I change my mind. The Israelites gathered their belongings. Their children. Their hope for a new future. And they marched toward freedom. But Pharaoh would not let them go so easily. He would change his mind. He would chase them down. And soon, the greatest moment of divine power would be revealed. The parting of the Red Sea awaited. The resistance of Pharaoh. The Nile River ran red. The cries of Egypt echoed through the palace halls. The gods of Pharaoh failed to stop the judgment that had fallen upon them. Yet Pharaoh remained unshaken. Your people will remain my slaves, he snarled at Moses. I will never let them go. His advisors stood in silence. They had seen the plagues. Felt the fear. Watched the waters turn to blood. Yet Pharaoh's heart hardened, his arrogance drowning out the warning signs of divine wrath. The Almighty was not finished. And Egypt was about to break. The second plague, the swarm of frogs. The Nile had barely returned to its original state when the next plague emerged. Frogs. Not just in the rivers. Not just in the fields. In the homes of every Egyptian. In their beds. In their food. Croaking, crawling, unrelenting. No escape. No refuge. Yet Pharaoh still refused to surrender. The third plague, lice and gnats. Moses stood before Pharaoh again. Let my people go. Pharaoh laughed. No. Then, the ground shifted. From the dust of the earth, swarms of lice and gnats arose, covering the bodies of every Egyptian, biting their flesh, infesting their skin. Even Pharaoh's sorcerers trembled, whispering, "This is the hand of God." Yet Pharaoh's pride remained unbroken. And so, the next plague began. The fourth plague, the swarm of flies. The skies darkened. The air filled with the buzzing of thousands, millions, of wings. Flies poured into Egypt, thick as the judgment that had fallen upon them. They infested every corner of the kingdom, driving the people to madness, desecrating homes, bringing rot and disease. But Pharaoh hardened his heart. Still defiant. Still resisting the inevitable. And judgment continued. The fifth plague, the death of livestock. The fields were silent. No movement. No life. Cattle lay lifeless under the sun. Horses and donkeys collapsed in the dust. Egypt's wealth crumbled as its livestock perished one by one. Yet Pharaoh did not yield. His kingdom was falling apart, yet his arrogance kept him shackled to destruction. More judgment awaited him. The sixth plague, boils and sores. From the heart of Pharaoh's palace to the furthest corners of Egypt, pain swept through the people. Boils erupted on their skin. Sores covered their bodies. No healer, no priest, no spell could remove their suffering. Even Pharaoh's sorcerers could no longer stand before Moses, their bodies weak, their flesh torn by the disease. Yet Pharaoh refused to listen. And so, the next plague fell upon Egypt. The seventh plague, fire and hail. The heavens split open. Fire and ice merged in unnatural fury. Hailstones crashed into homes, shattering the golden halls of Egypt. Fields burned, trees splintered, destruction rained down upon Pharaoh's kingdom. Egypt lay in ruin. Yet Pharaoh clenched his fists. His pride would be his downfall. The eighth plague, the locust invasion. Egypt had little harvest left after the hail. What remained, the locusts consumed. They covered the sky. They ate every last leaf. They devoured what little Egypt still had. And Pharaoh's kingdom fell into desperation. His advisors begged him. Do you not see? Egypt is ruined. Let the Israelites go. But Pharaoh hardened his heart. And so, the next plague arrived. The ninth plague, the darkness. Then, the sun disappeared. Not for hours. Not for a day. But for 3 days. A thick, suffocating darkness settled upon Egypt. A darkness so deep it could be felt. Candles would not light. Torches would not burn. Egypt was swallowed into a void of silence and fear. Yet still, Pharaoh refused. The final plague, the death of the firstborn. The Almighty spoke one last warning. If Pharaoh does not let my people go, the firstborn of Egypt will die. The Israelites prepared for their escape. They marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. They ate unleavened bread in haste, ready to flee. And at midnight, the plague swept across Egypt. Cries pierced the silence. Families wept. Pharaoh's own son lay lifeless in his arms. And at last he broke. Go, Pharaoh whispered. Go before I change my mind. The Israelites marched toward freedom. But Pharaoh would not let them go so easily. He would chase them down. And soon, the greatest moment of divine power would be revealed. The parting of the Red Sea awaited. The night was still. The Israelites marched forward, their feet kicking up the dust of a land they would never see again. Freedom was in their grasp. Yet behind them, Pharaoh's fury burned. The loss of his son had shattered his spirit, but his pride refused to let the Israelites go. Gather my army, Pharaoh commanded. We ride at dawn. The mighty chariots of Egypt thundered across the land, warriors armed with swords, bows, and an unrelenting hunger to reclaim their slaves. Pharaoh would not let them escape. He would hunt them down. Destroy them. Drag them back into chains. And soon, the Israelites would face the impossible. The Israelites had reached the edge of the Red Sea. Their journey was blocked. Behind them, Pharaoh's army approached at full speed. Before them, an endless ocean stretched into the horizon. There was no escape. Did you bring us here to die? The Israelites cried. Why did we leave Egypt just to be slaughtered? Fear surged through the crowd. Until Moses raised his staff. The wind shifted. The waves responded. And the voice of the Almighty thundered across the sky. Move forward. Then, it happened. The sea split apart. Not in chaos. Not in destruction. But in divine power. Towering walls of water rose on either side, stretching high into the heavens, frozen in supernatural defiance. The path to freedom appeared. Dry ground stretched before the Israelites, a road forged by the hand of eternity itself. Go, Moses commanded. Walk into your salvation. And they did. One by one, step by step, the people of Israel walked between the parted waves, their hearts pounding with awe, their voices trembling in whispered prayers. Pharaoh's army watched in horror. Yet pride blinded them. Ride after them. Pharaoh bellowed. If they can cross, so can we. The warriors charged into the path, their chariots cutting through the dry seabed, unaware that judgment was about to fall upon them. The Israelites reached the other side. Pharaoh's army was still in the center of the parted waters. Then, the voice of the Almighty roared across creation. The sea walls collapsed. Not in hesitation. Not in mercy. But in final judgment. The waves crashed into each other, swallowing Pharaoh's warriors, dragging them into the depths, drowning an empire that had once ruled with an iron fist. Egypt fell. The Israelites stood on the shore, their eyes wide, their spirits shaking. They had walked through the impossible. They had seen divine power. And they were truly free. The sun rose upon a new era. The Israelites were no longer slaves. They were a nation chosen by the Almighty Himself. Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women in song, her tambourine shaking with the rhythm of victory. Sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider He has thrown into the sea. The people rejoiced. Danced. Celebrated their freedom. But their journey was far from over. The wilderness awaited them. The trials of faith had only begun. And soon, they would stand before Mount Sinai to receive the covenant that would define them forever. The Israelites stood on the other side of the sea, their lungs still catching breath, their minds unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Slavery was behind them. Egypt had fallen. But the journey was far from over. Freedom came with uncertainty. The wilderness stretched before them, vast, dry, unfamiliar. And they were about to face tests of faith unlike any they had ever known. The bitter waters of Marah. The desert sun scorched their skin. Days passed. Their water supply ran low. Thirst turned into desperation. Then, they found an oasis. Marah. Their relief quickly turned to horror. The waters were undrinkable. Bitter. Poisoned. The people cried out, "Have we escaped Pharaoh just to die here?" But Moses lifted his hands toward the heavens. And the Almighty answered. He instructed Moses to cast a piece of wood into the waters, and instantly, they turned pure. The Israelites drank freely. And for a moment their faith was restored. But the challenges were far from over. Days passed. The food they had taken from Egypt began to run out. Hunger spread across the camp. Fear turned to complaints. Did we flee Egypt only to starve? Moses stood before the people, his voice calm, his faith unshaken. Watch. The Almighty will provide. And the heavens responded. At sunrise, manna appeared upon the ground, white, like coriander seed, sweet as honey. At dusk, quail descended, enough to feed every family. Divine provision. Food for the journey. A sign that they were never forgotten. But even with miracles, their faith would continue to be tested. Freedom did not come without opposition. The Amalekites, ruthless desert warriors, descended upon the Israelites. They had no army. No trained soldiers. Yet they were forced into war. Moses commanded Joshua, "Gather warriors. Prepare for battle." But the victory would not come from swords alone. Moses ascended a hill, his staff in hand, watching over the battle. Each time his hands were raised, the Israelites prevailed. Whenever he lowered them, Amalek gained ground. His arms grew weary. Aaron and Hur stood beside him, holding his hands up high, ensuring that the battle would not be lost. And by nightfall, Amalek had fallen. Victory belonged to Israel. And soon, they would stand before the Almighty Himself. The mountain loomed before them, its peak hidden in thunder and fire. The voice of eternity waiting to speak. The Israelites gathered at its base, trembling in anticipation. Then, the heavens roared. Lightning streaked through the sky. A voice echoed across creation. The Almighty spoke. A covenant was established, a law that would define the nation forever. Israel was no longer just a freed people. They were a people chosen. Set apart. Called to carry divine truth into the world. Their journey was not over. But their purpose had been revealed. The Israelites had wandered the desert for 40 years. 40 years of trials. 40 years of victories and failures. 40 years of learning faith. Generations had passed. A new people had risen, the ones who would finally step into the land promised to Abraham centuries before. But first, they would face their greatest challenge yet. The walls of Jericho. The promised land was not empty. Kingdoms ruled the land. Cities stood fortified. Armies waited in defiance. And the greatest fortress of all stood before them, Jericho. Its walls were unbreakable. Its warriors prepared for war. Its gates sealed shut, daring the Israelites to approach. Yet the Almighty spoke. This battle will not be won with swords, but with faith. The instructions came. The Israelites would march around a city once per day, for 6 days. On the 7th day, they would circle it 7 times. Then, they would lift their voices in a mighty shout. And Jericho would fall. The collapse of Jericho. The warriors inside Jericho laughed. Do these Israelites truly believe they can conquer us with marching and shouting? Yet the final day arrived. The Israelites circled the city 7 times. Moses' successor, Joshua, raised his hand. The people lifted their voices in one mighty roar. And the walls of Jericho collapsed. Stone crumbled. Dust rose. The fortress fell in an instant. Not by weapons. But by divine command. The Israelites rushed forward, claiming the city and marking the beginning of a new era. The settlement in the land. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. The promised land was theirs. The inheritance of Abraham's descendants had come to pass. Israel stood as a nation. No longer wandering. No longer lost. Their destiny fulfilled. The Exodus was complete, but their story was far from over. They had won the land, now, they had to learn how to keep it. And faith would be tested once more. The Israelites had arrived. No longer wandering. No longer slaves. A chosen people, standing in their inheritance. The Exodus had forged them, not just as survivors, but as a nation destined to carry divine truth into the world. But with great power came great responsibility. The laws given at Sinai would now define their path. Would they remain faithful to their covenant? Would they stand against their enemies? Would they fulfill the destiny promised to them? Their battles were far from over. Their story was just beginning. The land was divided among the 12 tribes. The Israelites settled. Built homes. Strengthened their communities. But challenges arose once more. Enemies threatened their borders. Faith wavered among the people. Leadership was needed. Thus, the age of judges was born, leaders chosen to guide Israel, warriors who would stand against the rising darkness. Each judge played a role, until the people demanded a king. The Exodus was not just an escape from slavery. It was the birth of a people. It was the fulfillment of a promise. It was the foundation upon which prophecy would be built. And from Israel's lineage, a king would rise. A king greater than any before him. A savior. The story of redemption had only just begun.